Good afternoon and welcome to the first of a regular series of webinars hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. These webinars will explore important economic issues and related work being done by the Minneapolis Fed. My name is Ron Wirtz. I'm editor of the Fedgazette, the bank's regional business and economics journal, and I will serve as today's host for the discussion today. Today, the Minneapolis Fed is formally launching the Center for Indian Counrty Development, or CICD, an effort that was first seeded more than 2 decades ago, gradually growing roots over time, and now sprouting a formal, dedicated office within the bank that is charged with helping Native American tribes achieve their economic development goals in Indian country. The purpose of this webinar is to give participants some background on both the needs for and the challenges of economic development in Indian country, to discuss the bank's past work in this area, and to outline the future work of the CICD. With us to discuss the new center and its development are the center's 2 co-directors, Sue Woodrow and Patrice Kunesh. Good afternoon and welcome. Along with her duties with the CICD, Sue Woodrow is an assistant vice president and executive of the Minneapolis Fed's branch office in Helena, Montana. She oversees branch functions and outreach and works extensively on tribal development. In particular, Sue has been instrumental in the development of national outreach for uniform commercial codes for adoption by tribal nations that will help improve access to credit and capital for consumers and businesses in Native communities. Our second panelist, Patrice Kunesh, previously served as Deputy Undersecretary of Rural Development at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She also served as Deputy Solicitor for Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of the Interior and was a faculty member at the University of South Dakota School of Law, where she directed the university's Institute of American Indian Studies. Patrice began her legal career at the Native American Rights Fund and has extensive experience representing American Indian tribes throughout the country. Also with us today is Dick Todd, Vice President of Community Development, who is also an advisor to the CICD. Dick is with us today to help answer data and other research questions related to Indian country. We'll start the webinar today by hearing from both Sue and Patrice. Sue will talk about the Fed's long-standing tradition of supporting development in Indian country, and Patrice will follow to talk about future plans for the Center for Indian Country Development. Following these remarks, we will have a Q&A session lasting roughly until 2:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. During our presenters' remarks, we encourage our listeners to send us questions in advance. In your WebEx window on the right side, select the Q&A section to post the question. You will have the chance then to submit your questions to me, Ron Wirtz. Make sure you select to send to Ron Wirtz and not to the default host or panelist accounts. Please note that this webinar is also being recorded and a replay will be available on our website at minneapolisfed.org after the webinar in the next couple of days. The slides from today's presenters will also be available on our website. With that housekeeping out of the way, Sue Woodrow will begin today's discussion with some brief remarks. Sue?
Thank you, Ron. We are so excited today to be able to share with the participants here about our new center, what we hope to do, and how we got here. And it's been a long time that we've been building towards this. So let me frame my remarks first by stating the mission of the center. And that is to help self-governing communities of American Indians in the United States attain their economic development goals. Now, going back to the early 1990s, the Minneapolis Fed, in particular the community development area, has slowly and solidly been building its involvement in Indian country. It began in the early 90s when there was a proposed banking merger that was denied on the basis that one of the institutions was in fact not serving the credit and financial services needs of an Indian reservation deemed to be in its service area. And that led our community development area to begin exploring, what were the issues, what were the barriers, why were we not seeing financial services being adequately deployed in Indian country. And so let me give you a little background on how we built our work. So our early efforts during the 1990s, the beginning of the 2000s, were really spent doing a lot of outreach, trying to really understand what the unique issues were, what those barriers were. We did sovereign lending workshops, we did various types of outreach, we convened financial institutions, community development groups, and others to really get a better handle on what the issues were. And that built over time. I think the real shift in our work becoming much deeper and broader began in about the mid-2000s. And there were a couple of things that really took us into this space more deeply. First, we began to explore more deeply what some of the institutional barriers were. In particular, looking at legal infrastructure. We became involved with the Uniform Law Commission that instituted a drafting project to draft a model Tribal Secure Transactions Act. Secure transactions laws, for our participants, are those laws that all of the states have on their books that really facilitate the flow of credit into communities. And we began to realize that many tribal governments did not have these laws on their books, or the laws were perhaps not familiar enough to lenders, banks, and others that made them feel comfortable doing business in Indian country. And so we really got involved, both on the drafting committee and then more broadly doing technical assistance and outreach to tribal governments and Native organizations, other entities working with tribal governments to really help start to build this commercial legal infrastructure that's so critical to support lending. At about the same time, we became involved with many diverse groups across our region to develop Indian business alliances. And I want to just stop there and, for our listeners, explain what our district, Minneapolis Fed District, is. It goes from Montana all the way to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So we've got Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, northwestern Wisconsin, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the UP. In that region, we have 45 Indian reservations. So we became involved with diverse groups, tribal governments, financial institutions, community development groups, state agencies, federal agencies, philanthropic groups, and we were instrumental in working with all of these partners in creating Indian business alliances, which we now have in 5 of these 6 states. And those Indian business alliances are really focused on supporting, advocating for the development of private businesses on Indian reservations, so really promoting Native entrepreneurship. So during this period, now well into the 2000s and up to the point where we are today, this took us into really looking at development more holistically. Access to credit is an issue that we hear about all of the time in Indian country, the barriers to credit. And so we broadened how we were looking at access to credit. There's a need for financial education. This is one of the other issues that we started to become involved in. Let's just look at slide number 3. Do we have slide number 3 yet? And so during this time, we really started to think more holistically in terms of nation building. All of the things that go into creating environments that are solid and are conducive and welcoming toward investment in business. Let's go on to slide 4. I already mentioned that we started to take a deep dive into the legal infrastructure and property rights institution building. This work became national in scope and still is today. But we also started to engage in some research initiatives and data analysis. I'm not going to get into the details of that. I'll defer to my colleague who can talk about that a little bit later. We've talked about the Indian business alliances. These alliances have become a real catalyst for things happening, not only in Indian country in their respective states, but together, regionally, they're working together. We also have been engaged in providing community reinvestment trainings for financial institutions and community development groups working in Indian country, where we're really convening groups together to really look at what the barriers are, look at alternatives, look at unique and interesting ways that we can get products and services and investment into Indian country. We've been engaged in supporting and advocating for Native community development financial institutions, often referred to as CDFIs. This is a growing and unique type of financial service provider that we're seeing great hope in terms of what they're bringing into these communities. And then we've also, of course, as I mentioned earlier, have realized what a critical role financial education has to play and how important this whole area of financial inclusion is. So over this 25-year period, the scope of our work has grown. We have grown in terms of how we understand Indian country, the unique jurisdictional issues that we have with tribal nations, the unique institutional differences. And our commitment with the establishment of this center is to stay in this work for the long term, to be a convener of groups, not just within our district, but across the country, to really energize work within the Federal Reserve System and beyond with national partners, and to hopefully play a very meaningful role at moving all of these various pieces forward. There are many areas that we've not gone into yet that we hope to, and I'll defer to my colleague Patrice to talk about some of those, but we're excited about the opportunities. We feel good about where we've been, but we have a lot of work left to do in our support role to help Native communities achieve their own development goals.
Great. Thank you, Sue. We'll now hear from Patrice Kunesh regarding the future plans for the CICD. Patrice?
Thank you. And that was a great introduction, Sue. The legacy work of the Federal Reserve Bank and Sue Woodrow is well known in Indian country. I used it myself in my work as a tribal attorney in drafting and implementing a comprehensive tribal commercial code. Now that I'm working with the Federal Reserve Bank and with Sue, we want to see that work grow and develop and expand throughout Indian country. Now, the center will be drawing upon the Federal Reserve Bank's expertise and proven record in research and convening. I'd like to see the center be a catalyst for economic development and thinking and problem solving, to be a premier provider of information and data and a new voice to the table, to foster relationships, to explore new and innovative ways of promoting economic, financial security. And the CICD is the first big step toward finding solutions to these very complex issues. Why is this issue so important today? I recently read a news article about the top issues facing Native peoples. We have 567 tribes, including 229 Alaskan Native communities, 45 just in this district alone, representing over 10% of the population and sometimes over 10% of the land base in that state. Each tribe is a nation unto itself. It's sovereign, self-governing, and self-determining. Native communities are often impoverished and jobless, and we've seen this historically. So these problems are not just only complex, but they're persistent. 27% of all Native Alaskans and Alaskan Natives and Native Americans per the U.S. Census Bureau are persistently poor. 3 of the top 5 of those tribal communities are in the Dakotas, and that is just not acceptable. In my own tribal community, Standing Rock, over 40% live in poverty. So on the horizon, issues for the Center for Indian Country Development to explore evolve around land and education. And if we could take a look at slide 5. Land is central to the Native identity and culture. It's also such a complicating factor since tribes do not own their own lands. We'd like to take a look at innovative ways to deal with some of these issues, such as leasing and the possibility of leasehold mortgages, which give people protection, support individual interests and investments. We also know that education is a very critical area on many tribal communities. Only 51% of Native Americans in the class of 2010, for example, graduated high school. We also know that the school conditions on Indian reservations are in structurally dangerous conditions. So we need to do something, and we need to do something very, very serious. Historically, schools have been underfunded, but we think we can take a look at a closer concern in the link between early childhood education, tribal colleges and universities, and ensure that we have the best data to support policy decisions. One of the other areas that we'd like to explore is the ULC Model Tribal Probate Code. Passing on lands really will be a tremendous support for economic development, as well as the land buyback program, a program of the Department of the Interior. So with many of our partners and collaborators, we know that we have a lot of work to do. It's going to be supported by data and our research arm. And it's going to be supported by the deep and historic work that Sue Woodrow and her team have done over the past few years. I'm very excited to get started.
Great. Thank you, Patrice. So now we'll move into the Q&A session portion of this webinar. And before we do, I want to remind our viewers and our listeners that there is a way to submit questions. So if in your WebEx window on the right side, there's a Q&A tab, make sure you submit to Ron Wirtz and not to the host or panelist accounts. So we'll look forward to seeing your questions. I'll start with the first one. And I'm wondering, one of the things that I've heard about during the center's development has to do with its fit here at the Minneapolis Fed. And I'm wondering, Sue, if you could briefly outline how the CICD fits with the Fed's mission.
I really would love to answer that, Ron, and the reason is I get that question frequently because it is confusing for people that don't understand all of the functions of the Federal Reserve. So I think there's really two primary reasons. First of all, the Federal Reserve, of course, is charged with ensuring overall that we have healthy economy. And at the micro level, our charge is really to understand our communities, the economies of our communities within our districts. And that includes, of course, in our district, in particular, our 45 Indian reservations. And Patrice already outlined some of the statistics where we have some dire conditions in these communities economically. But in addition, back in the late 70s, the Community Reinvestment Act was passed by the Congress to encourage federally regulated depository institutions to help meet the credit needs throughout the communities that they serve, including low and moderate income communities. And of course, one of the issues in particular that act was addressing were allegations broadly of financial institutions redlining low-income communities, basically acting discriminatorily toward them. So under that act, the federal bank regulatory agencies were charged really with two things. One, of course, was ensuring that banks, financial institutions were complying with the requirements of the Community Reinvestment Act to ensure that they weren't discriminating against certain communities and individuals. But second, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the OCC all were charged with creating a function, we call it community development today, that would really work with financial institutions, community development groups, educational institutions, and others to work together to look how we really could bring investment, credit products, and other financial services into these communities, consistent with safe and sound bank operations. And so really these two things factors are what help us to be engaged or really lead us to be engaged in our Native communities.
I'm wondering if we can talk quickly about the nature of data. And Dick, maybe I'll direct this question to you.
Sure.
It seems that any part with research is going to require data. And we have a question from a listener regarding the availability of data in Indian country. And this person asks, does the center directors have a plan to make the center a clearinghouse for Indian country data, and if so, how?
We are talking about that, and we are looking at providing more data on our website. In general, the lack of good data to inform decision-making by Indian country leaders remains a significant problem. And addressing that gap here at the center is an example of how the center will build upon existing Federal Reserve Bank initiatives. We are looking at providing what you might call reservation statistical profiles. I think that will come as we build out our website over time. We are also doing some other work. For example, the Center is stepping into an ongoing multi-year partnership with the U.S. Census Bureau and others to provide the first comprehensive analysis of the Indian country business sector. To do that, we will be first creating new data on reservation businesses for the Census Bureau. The center will also manage an existing partnership with outside scholars to study consumer credit use on reservations, and we'll try to provide data on that too. We already have, and we'll get some of that out on our website soon. Here again, in that project, we have to create the data first, in that case from consumer credit histories that the Federal Reserve has purchased. So we will be doing that, providing data and doing research. As we do, we have some other projects underway or under consideration, but as we go forward, we will be listening to our leadership council and to other Indian country thought leaders and scholars about the needs for research and the research protocols that apply in Indian country.
Patrice, one of the things that I think people will be interested in is partnerships. And I'm wondering if you can maybe give us an idea of some of your thoughts on the nature of partnerships kind of going forward for the center, and particularly with regards, there are 11 other district banks, as well as the Board of Governors. And I'm wondering if you can give us some ideas about what you're thinking about how this ties in with the other district banks.
Good question, Ron. I've already started to reach out to some of the other Federal Reserve banks that have centers that look at the Americas, for example, or household security. And what I'm finding is that our work will dovetail into their work, but we'll go in a different direction and perhaps further. Mainly because we are a national platform and we want to look across the Federal Reserve System at different work underway in Indian country. For example, in San Francisco, we have a tremendous amount of work looking into home ownership in Native American communities. So one of the big partners that we are going to be pursuing is with other Federal Reserve banks. Another source of partnership will be with federal agencies. We know that the federal government has a trust responsibility to Native American tribes and individuals and provide a tremendous amount of funding. So one of the areas perhaps to look at is how is that funding reaching tribal communities? How can federal agencies perhaps collaborate in a more efficient way to target funds between agencies, HUD, for example, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, for example, to support home ownership in Indian communities. Another really important area for collaboration and partnerships would be in the nonprofit spectrum. In our leadership council, in fact, we have subject matter experts on housing, on Native American finance, but we also need to look in terms of education, community development, the native CDFIs that Sue had mentioned. We want to look at thought leaders throughout the country and see what kind of work they've brought to bear, such as the Harvard project on Native American nation building. So we have a full spectrum of partnerships underway, building on the good work that Sue and Dick and Dorothy Bridges have already developed. And we want to go further and reach a broader array of potential partners.
And if I can just build on that a little bit too, and Patrice is absolutely correct. We're actually very excited about partnerships that we're going to build, about the partnerships that we currently have with some tremendous organizations. But I do want to mention also, we're excited about expanding partnerships and looking into partnerships with tribal colleges. The tribal college sector has grown and matured in significant ways over the last years, and we really look to them as a tremendous resource and hope to expand our partnerships throughout that area. But also, it would be remiss if we didn't mention our state agency partners as well. Sure. There are some state governments, agencies and divisions within some of our state governments that are doing really wonderful work in partnering with the tribes within their particular states. And we look forward to expanding those partnerships and encouraging others where we don't see it so much. And these are two other partners that we're very, very excited about continuing to work with as well.
Thanks, Sue. In recent years, there have been some pretty high-profile court rulings that have really been involving Indian lands, particularly Cobell versus Salazar, which initiated a really big buyback program on fractionated lands in Indian country, and that's been a very big program here in the 9th District. I'm wondering what role, if any, you imagine CICD having with regards to these broad-based programs or initiatives, maybe that come through rulings like this, maybe new federal programs or initiatives that come through. What role do you see the CICD playing?
I think this is a great opportunity for the center to use its research arm and the data guy to really take a look at what is the configuration of Indian lands after the land buyback. My own family has been involved in the Standing Rock buyback program, and we know that some have taken the offer and tribes will now have acquired those interests, but there'll be a different configuration of land ownership. So that is a huge undertaking to redo the maps, to understand ownership interests, and to then, once we map the new property interests, to understand where we can consolidate and zone in on economic development. One of the ways to do that, as I mentioned earlier, is through the Hearth Act. The Hearth Act is a program passed by Congress a couple years ago. I was with the Department of the Interior when both the Cobell suit was settled and the Hearth Act was passed. So both of these are tremendous catalysts to look at land, the best and most real and most historic asset of tribes for economic development. What the Hearth Act allows tribes to do is to be in the driver's seat of leasing programs. And that could be for rangelands such as grazing, livestock. It could be for agriculture development. Many of these leases have been overseen by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and outside of tribal control. Now the tribes have the opportunity to develop their own leasing programs for businesses, for developing natural resources, but also for housing. And we believe that full implementation of the Hearth Act will really be a huge generator of economic development as well as infrastructure development. So what the center can do is take a look at some of the obstacles to why the Hearth Act is not being fully implemented by tribes. There was a tremendous rollout a few years ago, but not many tribes have taken advantage of it. We would like to take a look and see if it's part of the land buyback attention, if there are other needs that tribes might have in terms of establishing a tribal law, tribal code on leasing, and see what we can bring in terms of identifying barriers and challenges and full implementation of the Hearth Act.
You've identified a lot of topics, a lot of issues. What is the sort of the fundamental gap that the center is really trying to fill here? Their economic concerns in Indian country really have the attention of many different federal agencies, state agencies as well, nonprofits, to say nothing of the tribes themselves, who obviously who have been working on this diligently for years. So what's the gap missing? What are you hoping to fill in terms of what's needed out there right now?
Well, I'll start, and then I'll have Sue step in here. Rigorous analysis and rethinking about some of the most pressing and prevailing assumptions around Indian country. I think we bring a new voice, a fresh look to the table. And what we've looked at, very substantially in the Federal Reserve Bank is the dearth of capital and the financial institutions in Native American communities. But we see that the gaps are not just financial, they're institutional and they're social. So we can bring this rigorous analysis with a proven track record of convening key stakeholders, thought leaders, as we said, forging partnerships. For example, we have the payment system that the Federal Reserve has undertaken with disparate parties, bringing all the different interests to the table, getting down to what is the nub of the issue, what is that knot that has to be unraveled. So that's what we can do in terms of both identifying the gaps and creating some innovative problem-solving solutions.
And Patrice has really covered this very, very well. I think really the only thing I would have to add to that is, in my experience over the 20 plus years that I've been working in this space, it's been very apparent to me that the Federal Reserve is a very trusted partner. And so when it comes to convening all sorts of groups, whether it's financial institutions, federal state agencies, educational institutions, philanthropic organizations, whoever it might be, the Federal Reserve seems to be a very, very trusted partner, and I think we bring something to the table there in that regard. I think that's our strength. And the establishment of this center really demonstrates our commitment to be in this work for the long term.
If I can follow up on that point. So I'm interested in how we've established that level of trust with tribes specifically. It's in terms of partnering with and leveraging the interests of tribes. We're doing this in their interests, and I think in national interest as well. But how do you leverage the partnership and their abilities across literally hundreds of tribes? How do you represent them all?
Well, first of all, we don't represent each and every or work with necessarily each and every individual tribe.
Right.
There are organizations working on the ground in very, very effective ways in their unique areas. We can come along in a variety of ways and support the work and the efforts that they do. I mean, I think about the opportunities we have in the research area. We constantly are hearing about what a data desert Indian country is. And in that regard, I think we have a lot to offer as we grow and develop this particular area of the work that we're going to be engaged in. But I think one of the main things, Ron, that I hear back when I'm working with partners, either Native organizations, tribes, or other organizations working in Indian country, is the Federal Reserve has been working in this space now for 2.5 decades. That in and of itself, I think, has created a reputation that we're in it for the long term. One of the damaging things that I have watched with other organizations and entities over the years is people come into Indian country, they do a project, whatever, and then they're out of Indian country. We've been there. And I think that we have created a reputation, a trusted reputation, with our Native partners, certainly within this district and we hope over time more broadly across the country. So we bring that piece.
And I would just add to that very comprehensive responses, these contacts and these relationships are really community-based. We know, as Sue had spoken about earlier with the Indian Business Alliances, those are people directly working with Indian tribes that we are connecting with. So we are a bridge. We are sort of a convener and a matchmaker in that sense. So by working with people in the community, we also are able to be a part of that community, understand their needs, understand their assets, and understand the possibilities of good economic development.
Yes.
So this, with the center's lean staff, it seems like there would be any number of directions, initiatives that you'd want to undertake. What is it you're first hoping to carve out? Is it primary research or technical assistance, networking, research and best practices? What are some of the things that you think coming out of the gate you really will be a priority for the two of you and for the center? Excuse me.
Well, first of all, thank goodness it isn't just the three of us doing this work. We have other areas within the Minneapolis Fed, other departments that have been engaged also in doing Indian country work for quite a long time. And I would be remiss if I did not mention a few of them. Our law department has been very engaged in supporting both the secure transactions work and now engaged also in working on the Uniform Law Commission's Model Tribal Probate Code. Our public affairs area has been engaged in this space for many years. We've had tremendous articles that have been published in our fedgazette publication pertaining to Indian country. And we hope to expand the work that departments in the bank can become engaged in similarly. Patrice mentioned our payments area. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity there. At the branch, the Helena branch, we have a Native American high school intern program that the branch is engaged in. We see opportunities to expand across many departments and divisions of our bank and have them contribute to this work. So the center really provides a platform to pull all of this work together that we're doing here at the bank, and not just at the bank, but as Patrice also mentioned, across the Federal Reserve System. We hope that we can be a catalyst, that we can bring some energy and some unity to the work that's being done across the system as well.
I wonder if there are any other topical issues that maybe you haven't touched on yet that you think will be important. One of the things I wonder about is whether or not there are individual tribes who maybe are further along in the development that you will use as catalysts for studying or for feedback. You know, people and tribes that you will look to for some direction in terms of new ways, new methods for economic development.
I don't think I would signal out, any particular tribe as like the model, but we intend to be in touch with a lot of people. There's all sorts of promising initiatives going on across the country. With our leadership council, we'll be in touch with tribal leaders and others involved here. So we'll be taking a broad look at best practices across the country, not just, with one or two tribes. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Patrice? Or?
Let me add to that. There's certainly well known that casinos have been tremendous economic drivers for Indian tribes in different parts of the country. But what is maybe surprising is that only 30% of tribes have casinos. Of the 567 tribes in the United States, only about 30% have casinos. And of that 30%, only 20% are doing well enough to make a difference in their communities. The other part of that is that casinos are very dependent on economic up and down. So when the economy is not doing well, tribal economies are particularly hard hit. So the key factor there is diversification. And we know that there are some tribes across the country that have learned this lesson well. They have diversified into many different areas, into food production, into recreation, into lots of different areas. And part of that diversification is also giving individual tribal members opportunities to become entrepreneurs. Just this weekend, I was eating Lakota popcorn. which is a brainstorm of the Lower Brule tribe in South Dakota. It's a very productive economic driver of that community, the best popcorn I've ever tasted. But things like that, a small niche, be it Lakota popcorn or Tonka bars or what have you, can be examples of what works and why does it work, and use the natural resources of that tribe to be its economic driver.
And one last question, then I think we'll wrap up. I'm wondering what relationships might be moving forward with the native CDFIs. Clearly, they have a role on many reservations and with many tribes, and I'm wondering how they work in the planning in terms of the early stages of the CICD.
You know, the native CDFI movement is proving to be fairly remarkable in terms of the impact that we're seeing in communities, native communities across the country. And these very unique financial services providers that also, they not only provide capital where otherwise entrepreneurs or consumers may not have access to capital, but they're providing business technical assistance, they're providing financial education, they're providing a wide range of services that go well beyond what you would find in a commercial bank, for example. We are excited by what we're seeing with native CDFIs. In fact, we are engaged in research in this arena to really look at, what are we seeing that is effective, where are we seeing some of the challenges for native CDFI development. But we'll be continuing to work in this area to get out best practices information, to get out research and data on the native CDFI movement. And we're connected with native CDFIs very closely through our involvement with the Indian Business Alliances in particular. This is a very, very promising area, and we hope to be very engaged in terms of watching how it's working, seeing where we can support this through sharing of best practices and being a connector again and an engager.
If I may just give an example of how a native CDFI is making a real difference in a community in the 9th District. And that would be Lakota Funds, I believe, who's working with the South Dakota Tribal Housing Coalition. Mm-hmm. They are an intermediary lender between the USDA Rural Development, my former agency, HUD, for example, even perhaps the BIA. So pooling those funds and bridging the funding and the technical assistant needs to provide home ownership opportunities for tribal people in South Dakota. Mm-hmm. So that's one very real, very positive, and very successful undertaking.
Thanks, Patrice. Dick?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in too on this one. I think we were just talking the other day about some of the fruits we've had from the workshops we do under the Community Reinvestment Act, where we bring together bankers, other financial institutions, and groups like CDFIs. Those conversations have been fruitful. Banks find it increasingly attractive, we think, to work with native CDFIs, partner with them. And we're able sometimes to help set those partnerships up, bring people together so they can meet each other and find that they do indeed have mutual interests in working together to meet the financial needs in Indian country. So the CDFIs need the banks find the CDFIs useful, and we help to bring the two together often.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for all of our panelists, Sue Woodrow, Patrice Kunesh, Dick Todd. Thank you for joining us today. That ends our webinar today, but it doesn't end the work, as that is just starting now. We appreciate the time that listeners took to participate in this webinar, and I know that the Center looks forward to continuing engagement with all of you going forward, as you clearly have an interest in this topic. Listeners can also expect more webinars from the Minneapolis Fed to discuss relevant economic and policy issues and our work in these areas. We want to thank you all again for taking the time to join us today. Take a look at our website that went live today for the Center for Indian Country Development, and we hope everyone has a nice day. Thank you for joining us.